these are the ways that I think um, about research um, about African relations with ourselves and with others. Now, I'm going to probably preach to the choir. Africa is huge, and so when we think about regional cooperation, why do we even want to cooperate? And so I try to do some sorts of. So I'm from Kenya. And so some days I ask, why do I want to cooperate with people in Senegal? Do we have things in common? Now, African cooperation has been in our past maybe 60 years or so. If you think about people like Kwame Nkrumah, they always talked about cooperation. And so maybe it's in our DNA, or maybe we were imitating Europe, imitation being the best form of flattery. I don't know that we were necessarily doing that. Um, Now, so I do spend a lot of time researching Africa. I'm probably spending more time researching East Africa. And so some of these examples will come from East Africa, but I think they can be equally applied to, for example, West Africa, ECOWAS, Southern Africa with COMESA and SADC. And so again, Africa is huge. Are we imitating Europe? And if we were, um, clearly the map shows us that we have about maybe three times the size of Europe and almost three times the population. How do you get cooperation between these kinds of disparate groups and peoples and languages and ways of lives? And so to me, Western theories do not necessarily explain cooperation in Africa. And so I struggle with this. I struggle with believing that all the internationally oriented theories help us to understand cooperation in Africa. And so clearly Africa is complex, and we cooperate across different areas. This is actually regional economic communities, which I often refer to as RECs. And so they exist and they are overlapping with each other. There are countries that are in many of these regional economic communities, which I should add are the building blocks of an African polity, which hasn't quite succeeded. But so we cooperate. I think my biggest question is why? So in a perfect world, this would be how cooperation in Africa would have looked like, different regional economic communities cooperating and then eventually coming to an African Union in the vision of Kwame Nkrumah. We are still quite a ways from there. Now, let's this presentation has everything, including polls and quizzes and those kinds of things. But so I always pose this question, sometimes to the wrong audience. If we were to measure our level of how African we are, so I ask this question: if you're making English tea and you run out of sugar, what do you do? Do you stop making the tea? Do you go to the store and buy more sugar? Do you plant sugarcane? That might take a while. So if you have the answer to that, most of what we do in terms of cooperation in Africa is to actually, you go to your neighbors and ask them for sugar and all kinds of things, salt, fire, those kinds of things. And so to me, there's a level of cooperation in the West. You probably go to the store and buy more sugar. So to me, there's more. Africa is different, and you find a lot of these, it's different, but it's also similar. So I don't think that it's only in Kenya where you go to your neighbors and borrow some sugar. I think this probably also happens in most of the rest of Africa. And so can we then understand Africa based on the same perception or the theories that have come out of the West? As Dr. Bai was speaking to this, and I don't know. So if you think about appropriate technology or imported technology, I think about concepts of international relations and whether these are imported and whether we should really think about how we cooperate and why we cooperate. So, as I mentioned, we cooperate a lot. For example, Kenya is in 3 different regional economic communities. Not sure why. If you count the number of membership years that each of these countries has been in different regional economic communities, that's a lot. And so I don't know that we have good explanations. Africa is not Europe. But if you keep looking, you see even more attempts at cooperation. For example, the Congo wants to join, Somalia wants to join, South Sudan joined, and because actually membership to regional economic communities can be good for you or not good for you. For example, Sudan was compelled, South Sudan was compelled to do some things to put together a government of national unity. But there are bigger reasons for South Sudan cooperating with East Africa. Now, this is a second, maybe unscientific survey. I always ask my students and tell them not to check on Google or internet, whether a zebra is white with black stripes or black with white stripes. I don't know what your perception is. So part of my whole approach here is that maybe our perception of why African societies cooperate cannot be explained. It's sort of like this puzzle if you don't quite know the answer. Now, for the record, a zebra apparently is black with white stripes, despite everything else to the contrary. I wanted to include a bunch of theories here and their origins and sort of how they explain cooperation. And so what I try to do is to subject them to the conditions of cooperation in African nations. I also want to mention, before we go on further, that Steven Pinker, I believe, wrote that amazing book, Better Angels of Our Nature, where he traces 14,500 wars. If you look at the interstate wars between different countries, Africa is actually not very well represented. We do fight each other, that I admit, but we don't have those kinds of wars that kill 50 million people and so on. So can we understand our relations with each other the same way Europe understands its relations with each other? And so these are some of the sources of theories. These are some of the theories of foreign policy making, because I think relations between countries are essentially foreign policy making. Now, there are theories that you can look at and say, well, of course, this checks all the boxes. Why does Kenya and Uganda or Kenya and Tanzania cooperate? It's because they can moderate their state's behavior, frameworks for interactions, mechanisms to reduce cheating. So you do see that there is some attribution to Western theories, but I don't know that I'm still convinced. And I'm not going to bore you with all the international relations theory, including, for example, collective actions, self-interest, dilemmas of common interests and aversions. Now, of course, they have some of those. For example, East Africa, the Horn of Africa now is going through another drought and a locust infestation. So how do you actually get these are common problems, those, but I don't know that the Kenyan president sits and says, well, we have a dilemma of common interest or common aversion. We have all the shadows of the future and those explanations, but my explanation is much more simple. And part of it was captured in the new Tanzanian president's speech to Kenyan parliament. It was hilarious. She made fun of our Swahili. But part of that is, and I think she captures this by speaking to the wild animals that are brothers and neighbors. And if you're familiar with the Great Wild Beast Migration, this kind of captures the essence of you can't really ask the animals to stop, and because they live in a different country, migration patterns. And so not only are there shared animals, but there's also populations, Kenyan Maasai and Tanzanian Maasai, Kenyan Somalis and Somalia Somalis. Now, of course, sometimes we fight over those things. But one of the references that Suluhu Hassan made was she called Kenya's president Kaka, which is sort of the Swahili word for older brother. and there's some, I think, a meaning to that is familial more than it is international relations. And so when we borrow concepts to explain phenomena, I feel like we miss out on some other things. And I think I'm only going to briefly mention the Kikuyus, who are one of the groups in Kenya, and some of what their cultural traditions are. So, for example, my brother's children call me dad. In the West, they would call me uncle. And so if you're trying to explain to someone that these are your kids, but they are not your kids, it's and so I think when we take these cultural realities and ask ourselves, do they factor in our making of foreign policy? And so my suspicion is that African cooperation across countries is much more defined by Pan-Africanism, by Ubuntu, Undugu, those notions of familial relations, more than it is the 20-year crisis by E.H. Carr. But sometimes you want to throw a spanner in the works, and sometimes I ask myself, what if we assumed Ubuntu is actually a concept that works and then leave it to the political scientists to prove that it does not? So that's what I might do there. Now, briefly, I'm going to talk about Ubuntu, which is spelled very differently. There's a very big challenge to translating Ubuntu, and there are words that we know are generally tough to translate. But I think Ubuntu is why states cooperate. Ubuntu checks both the African cooperation box and some of the international theory boxes. And so I think this is why. And so the ultimate goal was to probably come up with to look at how we cooperate and why we cooperate, and maybe think about how we can explain that in terms that are familiar to us, not necessarily because we are borrowing a concept. And so you see the concepts of Ubuntu around Africa, and some of those include, for example, Ujamaa, the sort of familial, Harambe. I'm not even going to try to pronounce some of those other things now. And so part of my whole question is, what if we don't actually have to fight? What if cooperation is the default? And so to actually—
Dr. Magu, you have 3 minutes left.
Yes.
Right.
Thank you. So the definition of the philosophy is collection of values and practices that Black people of Africa, authentic human beings, authentic individual, but part of a larger regional, relational, communal, and societal world. So when you think about the spiritual world, religions, African religions, and so on, and to quote Desmond Tutu, recently departed, he really puts it in a way that is understandable to us. We are not autonomous beings, especially when we are babies. We are part of a whole. And so why is it that we are thinking that we can sort of separate ourselves from the whole? And now this will sound like criticism of the individualist Western society, but it is not. It's just a question of, is there a different way to look at African cooperation? So these are some of the definitions of Ubuntu: respect, dignity, caring, sharing, humanity, morality, group solidarity, compassion, respect. And so you do see some of those repeating: human dignity, respect, inclusivity. Now, as I mentioned, we do fight, but I think that we can define African relations or cooperation using Ubuntu, these ideas of oneness, of commonness, now across African countries, you find elements of the concepts. And so I try to list some of the countries where you find related concepts. Some people say it's really mostly a word that is derived from Bantu communities, the three major, I don't know whether to call them, they are not ethnic groupings, the Bantu, the Kushites, and the Nilotic peoples. So you do see in many countries that this concept exists. uh, re- it's sometimes is in us, maybe kindness to other people, the shared humanity, but I feel like I think it's an excellent way to think about how we relate to each other. Now, this is my last minute. We do sometimes be petty. For example, there's this island in Lake Victoria that Kenya and Uganda fights over. It's about a square mile. It's rich in fish. Well, so sometimes we also fight. For example, Kenya and Tanzania with the previous president burning day-old chicks, selling Kenyan cows. But so again, if you think about our fights, they are family fights. We are not murdering thousands of people. We also try to speak to other people to support us. And so in closing, I will say that I think there's a way to maybe consider our relations with each other as a basis for thinking about how internationally we cooperate with each other. I'll be happy to hear your questions. Thank you for listening, and thank you for your time.
Thank you so much, Dr. Magu. And we will, I think you started the recording for yourself, so we will pause it now as we move into the next presenter, unless Philip would like the recording to continue. I will introduce our next speaker, and Philip